Okay, so here we are at the anatomy of the respiratory system. Luckily, this is probably one of the more straightforward anatomical systems that we'll cover. So, without further ado, we'll generally follow a pathway that air would flow into your body. So, starting at the nose or the nostrils, we'll see an image of this in a moment. So, I find with anatomy it's always helpful to see, but we'll go through it verbally and then look at the photo or the image so that we have our nose, two nostrils, goes back into the nasal cavity, into the pharynx, past the larynx, into our trachea, which then splits into our bronchi, splits farther or like tree branches into bronchioles, and then we finally end up at probably the most important anatomical structure for our respiratory system, which is the alveoli, where gas exchange takes place. So again, if we take a little look here, here's our nostrils. This is the nasal cavity. It goes through this area. Not that you need to know it, but these little bridges of tissue, essentially, they're called meatus or meatai, and essentially they narrow where the air can pass through to help warm and humidify the air before it gets back into our pharynx, which is here at the back of our throats, and then into our larynx, which is here. If we were to go the other way, that's our esophagus, but we take a anterior movement here at our epiglottis, which is that little flap that covers the esophagus, and for when we're digesting food. But we'll go into the larynx, and that's where we enter the trachea. So the trachea is kind of the pure, uninhibited respiratory channel at any point in time above here, especially like throat, our mouth downward. We could potentially have food, but we get here into the trachea, which then branches into the right and left primary bronchi or bronchus, and then splits farther into these little tree branches. Still a fairly thick and solid passageway for air to pass through at this point in time, until we get to the bronchiole, which we notice are quite thin and end up at the alveolar sacs. Okay, and you'll notice here as well all the capillary beds that cover around the alveoli, which occurs on all of them, but is just depicted here on some. So in order to understand a bit farther some of the functions that this anatomy brings us, and again, we'll dive into the physiology on further lectures, but one of the main ones, I've already kind of said these just in passive by trying to explain the anatomy. So it conducts air into and out of the lungs. It exchanges gases between air and blood, primarily at the alveoli, or almost exclusively. It humidifies the air, so to make sure that our airways don't dry out and don't become patent anymore. It'll warm the air because, again, it's within our body, and we have a few structures like the meatus to help us out with that. And last but not least, it filters the air before air actually gets to our alveoli where we have gas exchange, because those are fairly filters air heading in before it hits the alveoli. Sorry if that was repeated. I had a little quick pause there. So our mucus traps airborne particles, and muci lines most of our respiratory tract. There's little cilia. So cilia are kind of like finger-like projections that essentially provide motility to the internal components of our they're kind of like finger-like projections that help move more solid particulate or expedient, which is like if you've ever had a cough and had try to cough up some dried mucus or something like that, the cilia would help with that as well. Oftentimes in people who smoke, a lot of the smoke and that coughing comes from some of the cilia trying to move from the lower respiratory tract upward some of that particulate. And particles that are not caught by mucus, they're engulfed by macrophages, so that's large white blood cells. Again, typically after they engulf some of the particulates, if it's within the respiratory tract itself, for example, if you have an infection of some sort, that too will start to be coughed up. And that's how you get different colorations of your mucus as well, is based off of how much infiltrate from your white blood cells make it into your respiratory tract. Okay. Of debate, and I think of notable interest, is whether the hairs that are within our nostrils or our nares help to filter air or not. There's some debate as to how much that may help, but I definitely think it's partly involved as well, if not creating some sort of interference to slow some of the air to cause more surface interaction with air and, say, mucus and in your nostrils. Okay, so that's kind of the broad function and different anatomical structures that are present in the respiratory system. But one of interest in particular is the alveoli, and really needs a lot more of our attention. So alveoli, if you remember, are these, again, sac-like bundles of tissue at the end, at the very terminal branches of our respiratory system, and they're attached to the bronchioles, and that is exactly where the site of what we'll say gas exchange occurs, right? So it's where oxygen and carbon dioxide either enter our blood or exit our blood into the air. We have about 300 million in our lungs, and the reason we have these is to create a lot of surface area. So, if we were to just have a single tube that just ended at that point in time, there's only so much surface area in which the capillary beds can wrap around. But if you have a bubble with lots of capillary beds and then another bubble, and it's just, again, it creates a lot of surface area. And so once we get down to the site of gas exchange in the alveoli, we notice that the respiratory membrane is only 2 cells thick. And so one comes from the side of the alveoli, and the other is the capillary wall. If you recall, when we were going through our cardiovascular system, we mentioned that the capillary beds are only 1 cell thick, right? So if we take a look at this here in this slide, we have here's like an alveoli and a capillary bed completely surrounding it. This blue square looking thing is just indicating that the cell is being transected, or the alveoli is being transected. So you can see truly that the capillary bed engulfs the alveoli, and it's just that empty bubble of full of air and some surfactant and other light fluids on the wall. And so if we were to even zoom in a little bit more here on the wall, we'll see represented here we have the alveolar wall, just 1 cell thick, and then the capillary wall, 1 cell thick as well. And the reason for that is, again, oxygen that's being carried by one of the 4 protein groups, the globin loops on hemoglobin, can allow oxygen just to pass through that membrane really easily, uninhibited, and carbon dioxide to leave down the pressure gradient. That's how the alveoli and capillary wall are structured and why it works that way.